The cowboy man used his last $3 to buy the Apache woman from slavery, to buy her freedom. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The trading post at the edge of town wasn't much to look at. Its boards were sun-bleached and warped, patched in places with whatever the owner could scavenge. Rusted tin, a broken wagon wheel, even hide stretched tight across gaps where daylight slipped through. The inside carried the smells of sweat, damp leather, stale tobacco smoke, and the sour stench of spilled whiskey left too long on the floorboards. It was the sort of place where men came to trade pelts, buy cheap liquor, or pick up supplies before heading back out into the emptiness of the territory. Clay Mercer pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning. His boots were caked with trail dust, and the brim of his sweat-stained hat shaded most of his face. Asha stayed closest to Levi, working beside him at the corral, handing him nails, her shoulder brushing his arm as though reminding him she was there. The bond between them had grown stronger since the storm, unspoken but undeniable. One afternoon, word came from town. A trader who passed by stopped for water at Levi's well and carried news in his casual way. Heard those ranch hands got themselves drunk again. Sheriff's keeping an eye. Says they won't risk pushing Boone no more. Reckon you made your point. He said it with a half smile, tipped his hat, and rode on. Levi stood silent a long while after the trader left, the bucket rope dangling in his hand. Relief pressed through him, but so did something heavier. He told himself he would go in, buy what he needed, and leave before the evening crowd filled the post. But the room wasn't as quiet as he hoped. At the far end, near the wall where sunlight bled through cracked boards, a man in a greasy vest tugged forward a young Apache woman. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, red marks burned deep into her skin from where she had been tied too long. She was barefoot, toes raw from dirt and splinters. Her deerskin dress clung to her body in torn shreds, the neckline ripped down and the side split, showing skin where the fabric had been pulled apart. She held herself upright, though her breathing was uneven and strands of her long black hair clung to her face. The trader lifted her arm like she was no more than an object. Strong enough to work, he barked, his voice heavy with drink. Quiet enough not to cause trouble. You won't find better stock in this territory. The words made Clay's stomach turn. Men standing around began to murmur. One laughed and tossed a coin into the air before catching it. Another leaned forward, eyes running down her body without shame. Their voices rose in half-serious bids. $2. $3. She stood still, chin raised, refusing to meet their eyes, but Clay saw her chest rising and falling faster, her jaw clenching with each shout. Clay shifted where he stood, hands tightening at his sides. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He hadn't come for this. He was barely holding his own spread together. 2 horses, a half-collapsed barn, and cattle that needed more feed than he could afford. Taking on someone else's fight was the last thing he needed. But he couldn't look away. The trader yanked the rope again, jerking her forward. She stumbled, her knees striking the plank with a hollow crack. A flash of pain crossed her face, but she steadied herself back straight again. Pride kept her standing, but Clay saw the tremor in her arms, the fear hiding behind her steady eyes. He felt something twist in his chest. He thought of his younger sister, long gone now, and how he would have killed any man who dared handle her this way. He thought of the quiet nights on his land, the silence he told himself was freedom, but which sometimes felt more like punishment. The bidding rose again. Coins flashed in calloused hands. The trader smirked, pulling the rope as though showing off livestock. Clay's hand went to his belt pouch. He knew what was in it. Just enough silver for flour, beans, and salt. Enough to last him until spring, if he stretched it. Spending it here would mean weeks of hunger, maybe worse. He had to make a choice, and quickly. His heart beat heavy, his thoughts cutting back and forth. Walk out the door and keep to himself, or stay and step into something that wasn't his concern. If he left, she would belong to one of the men circling like vultures, men who wanted her for reasons that had nothing to do with giving her shelter or respect. He felt his jaw lock. His boots moved before his mind finished deciding. "I'll take her," Clay said, voice rough and steady. The room stilled for a moment. A few men laughed, thinking it a joke. The trader squinted at him, then at the pouch Clay tossed down. The coins spilled across the table, clinking sharp in the silence. It wasn't much. It was all he had. The trader's grin widened. "Not much left in your pocket, cowboy, but it'll do." He swept the coins into his palm, then shoved the rope into Clay's hand. For a moment, Clay didn't move. He looked at the rope, the fibers rough in his palm, then at the woman. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp with suspicion, but behind it something else flickered. Confusion, maybe even the faintest edge of hope, though it was buried under layers of mistrust. She wasn't thanking him, not yet. She was asking, silently, why? Clay didn't have an answer, not one he could put into words. He loosened the knot around her wrists, just enough for her to walk without tearing skin, then lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Come on." Outside, the sun beat down on the dirt street, townsfolk pausing to watch. Some muttered, others sneered. Clay ignored them, leading her to where his horse was tied. She hesitated, looking at the animal, then at him. For a second, he thought she might run. Instead, she placed her hand on the saddle and climbed up, her movements unsteady but determined. Clay swung up behind her, taking the reins. He didn't say a word as he nudged the horse forward, leaving the post behind. He had no plan for what came next, only the certainty that he couldn't have done otherwise. The last of his money was gone, and his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet see. The horse moved at a steady pace along the rutted trail leading out of town, hooves sending up small clouds of dust that clung in the fading sunlight. Clay kept his eyes forward, jaw tight under the shadow of his hat brim, hands steady on the reins though his stomach turned with unease. Behind him, the sound of the trading post grew fainter until it was swallowed by the open land. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could still feel the weight of the stairs, the muttered words, the quiet laughter that had followed them as they left. A man spending the last of his coins to buy an Apache woman. Some saw it as foolish, others as shameful, and more than a few assumed they knew exactly why he had done it. The truth was harder to name. The woman sat stiffly in front of him, shoulders drawn tight, her long black hair lifting slightly in the evening breeze. She hadn't spoken a word since climbing onto the horse, and Clay hadn't expected her to. He kept a careful distance, his chest not quite touching her back, though the space between them was thin. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself as if ready to spring at the first chance. He wondered if she might try to run once they stopped. Part of him almost hoped she would, if it meant she could find freedom on her own terms. But another part of him, the part that had forced his hand in that trading post, wasn't ready to see her vanish into the dark hills, barefoot, hungry, and with nowhere safe to go. They rode until the town was no more than a smudge behind them, the land opening wide into rolling scrub and scattered mesquite. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon with dull red light that would soon be gone. Clay's cabin wasn't far, a few miles from the creek that cut through the valley, but the weight of silence made the distance stretch. He cleared his throat, the sound rough after hours of not speaking. "Name's Clay Mercer," he said, his voice low, uncertain if she'd answer at all. "Got a place a ways out. Ain't much, but it's dry, and there's food." She didn't turn her head. For a moment he thought she might stay silent, but then, almost too soft to hear, she said, "Naya." The word was quick, guarded, but clear. Clay gave a small nod she couldn't see. At least now he had a name to hold on to. He kept his eyes on the trail, but his thoughts turned. He wondered how long she had been kept like that, bound and displayed. He wondered who had captured her in the first place. Raiders, soldiers, or men who made their living hunting the vulnerable. He didn't ask. He could see by the rigid way she sat, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, that questions would only build more walls. The sky was nearly dark by the time they reached the cabin. It stood plain and weather-worn. A single-room structure Clay had built himself over years of piecemeal work. The corral leaned against one side, holding his two horses. The barn sagged in places, a roof half covered with patchboards, but it still kept the worst of the weather out. Smoke stains marked the chimney, and the door creaked when he pushed it open. It was no fine home, but it was the only thing he could call his. He dismounted first, then held the reins while Naya slid down. She moved cautiously, as if expecting a trick, her bare feet touching the packed earth with a wince. Clay noticed the raw skin along her soles, dirt pressed deep into the cuts. He thought about offering to carry her inside, but kept the thought buried. She would see pity in that, maybe weakness too, and he guessed both would earn only more mistrust. Inside, the cabin was dim but warmer. Clay lit a lantern, its glow stretching across the rough-hewn table. A single cot against the wall, and a stone hearth where the ashes from the morning fire still smoldered. The room smelled of smoke, leather, and the faint scent of horse that clung to his clothes. He set his hat on the peg near the door, then moved toward the hearth, crouching to stir the ashes back to life. Naya lingered near the door, her back straight, eyes darting across the space as if measuring the distance between every object and every way out. She didn't sit. She didn't relax. Clay kept his movements slow, deliberate, letting her see he wasn't in a hurry to corner her. "I'll get food started," he said, voice even. He took a tin pot, filled it from a small bucket of water near the door, and set it over the flames. He added beans from a sack, a pinch of salt from a jar. The work was simple, almost automatic. He'd done it so many nights alone that he barely thought about it. But tonight he felt every motion under her watchful eyes. When the beans began to soften, he ladled some into a tin plate and set it on the table. Then he stepped back, folding his arms loosely, and waited. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes flicked from him to the food, then back again, suspicion clear on her face. Slowly, as if testing a trap, she stepped forward and lowered herself onto the bench. She picked up the spoon and ate, careful, quiet, though the speed with which she swallowed told him how hungry she really was. Clay busied himself with cleaning his rifle on the other side of the room, giving her space. He thought about the questions she must have. Why had he spent his last coins? What did he expect from her now? He didn't have easy answers, not even for himself. All he knew was that the sight of her on that platform had torn something loose in him, something he couldn't have ignored without hating himself for it. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully, her eyes rising to meet his for the first time since they'd left town. There was no thanks in them, not yet, only a sharp kind of measuring. She wanted to know what kind of man he was. He could see it plain. Clay nodded once, not looking away. "You'll sleep in here by the fire. Cot's mine, but the floor's warm enough. Tomorrow, I'll see about getting you shoes. You can decide if you want to stay or leave when you're stronger." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes lingered on him a moment longer before she lowered them to the firelight. Clay stretched out on the cot, boots still on, rifle propped within reach. His mind turned over the choices that had led him here. He had no money now, no plan for how to make it through the next weeks. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman who had every reason to hate men like him, who might vanish the first chance she got. But as he lay staring at the low ceiling, listening to the faint rustle as she settled onto the blanket near the fire, he felt something he hadn't in years. The cabin no longer seemed as empty. Clay woke before dawn, the way he always did. The cabin was quiet except for the low pop of coals in the hearth. He turned his head slightly and saw Naya curled under the blanket near the fire. She hadn't moved much through the night. Her breathing was steady but shallow, her knees tucked up against her chest like she had learned to take up as little space as possible. In the faint glow, Clay noticed her hands resting near her face, the skin at her wrists raw from the rope that had bound her. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and pulled on his boots. For years he had lived by routine. Rise before the sun, split wood, tend the horses, and check the cattle. Nothing had changed that pattern except his own aging bones. But now there was someone else in the room, and it made each step heavier. He wondered if she would still be there when he came back in from the yard. Outside, the morning air bit sharp against his face. The ground was hard, the grass thin, and the horizon stretched wide with no sign of neighbors. His spread wasn't much. 80 acres that looked like more than they were, most of it too dry for good grazing. He had 2 horses, 3 cattle that survived off scrub and what hay he could trade for, and a patch of land he tried to scratch a living from. His barn leaned, his fences sagged, and his roof leaked in the spring rains. But it was his, and that had been enough. Until yesterday, anyway. He set to work with the axe, splitting logs and stacking them along the wall. Each crack of wood against steel echoed across the still land. As he worked, his mind circled back to the same question. What now? He had bought her freedom, but freedom without a plan was no kindness. She had no shoes, no supplies, and nowhere safe to walk to. He knew the nearest Apache band had been pushed north 2 winters back, and soldiers patrolled the hills beyond. If she tried to leave on her own, she wouldn't make it far before hunger or worse caught her. By the time he returned inside, the sky had begun to pale. Naya was awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire, watching him with the same sharp eyes as the night before. She hadn't touched anything in the cabin. The tin plate from supper was still on the table, the spoon resting neat inside it. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, tangled but still striking in the lantern light. Clay set the wood down by the hearth. "You eat?" he asked, though he could see she hadn't. She shook her head once, slow. He busied himself at the stove again, cooking another pot of beans. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. As he moved about the cabin, he felt her eyes on him, following every step, every sound. Not trust, just watchfulness, as if memorizing where he kept things, how close he came, what he might do next. He slid the plate toward her when the beans were done. This time, she didn't hesitate as long. She ate steady, each spoonful quick, but her back stayed rigid, ready to bolt if needed. Clay leaned against the table, arms crossed, keeping his voice even. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. Get shoes. Maybe a dress. You'll need both if you're going to decide whether to stay or go." Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She looked at him then, eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge his meaning. Stay or go? Was that truly her choice? He held her gaze, not moving, and after a moment, she set the spoon down again. "I don't trust you," she said finally, her voice low and rough. Her English carried the clipped edge of someone who had learned it secondhand, but her words were sharp enough. Clay nodded once. "Don't blame you." He didn't try to argue. He knew better than to expect trust bought with a handful of coins. She went back to eating, slower now. Silence filled the space between them, heavy but not unbearable. Clay let her finish before he spoke again. "I don't want nothing from you," he said, his voice steady. "Not food, not work, not what those men thought. You're free to leave. But if you do, I reckon you won't get far without shoes or supplies. So at least wait until you got those." Naya's jaw tightened. Her eyes dropped to the fire, and for the first time since he had seen her on that platform, she looked less like stone and more like someone carrying too much weight. She didn't answer him, but she didn't argue either. Later that morning, Clay saddled his horse to ride the fence line. He kept half an eye on the cabin as he worked, wondering if she would be gone by the time he came back. He imagined her walking barefoot across the scrub, bloodied feet pressing into sharp stones, the sun burning down, no water to drink. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When he returned at midday, she was still there. She had tidied the table, stacked the wood he'd left by the hearth, and swept dirt from the floor with a willow branch she must have found outside. Small things, but they startled him. He hadn't asked, hadn't expected it. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, watching her move about his cabin, and it felt strange. For years, this space had been silent, filled only with his own footsteps. Now it carried hers too. That night, when he spread the blanket near the fire for her again, she hesitated before lying down. Her eyes lingered on him as he settled onto the cot. He could feel the weight of that look, as if she were still testing, still waiting for the moment he might show himself to be no different than the others. Clay rolled onto his side, facing the wall, making sure his hands stayed clear and his breathing even. It took a long time for sleep to come, but when it did, he realized he felt something unfamiliar. Not comfort, not yet, but a sense that the silence of his cabin had shifted into something less lonely. The following morning broke clear and cold, the air so thin it carried sound farther than usual. Clay had been up since first light, checking the corral and scraping frost off the trough. He moved with the same practiced rhythm he always had, but his mind wasn't settled. Every time he stepped away from the cabin, a part of him expected to return and find her gone. Yet when he pushed the door open again, there she was, sitting cross-legged near the fire, her hands busy pulling apart strips of dried willow bark she must have gathered while he worked. She twisted them into a thin cord, her movements precise and quiet. It struck Clay as odd. She could have slipped out while he was bent over the corral or fetching water from the creek, but she hadn't. She stayed. He didn't say anything at first, only nodded and set his hat on the peg. He moved about the cabin, pulling out a small sack of flour, measuring out enough to make flat cakes for breakfast. He caught her watching him, but her eyes darted away when he looked back. "You could have run," he said finally, his voice low, not accusatory, just a fact. Her hands stilled over the cord, then resumed. "No shoes, no water, no tribe," she answered after a pause. Her English was broken but clear. Nowhere to go. Clay felt the words sit heavy in the room. He knew what it was to be without anyone. After the war, after losing his wife and boy to fever in the same cruel winter, he had cut himself off from people. He had worked cattle until his back broke down, then scraped enough money together to buy his friend's land when the man passed without kin. Since then, he had lived small, speaking little, because speaking only reminded him of what he no longer had. He wasn't about to lay all that before her, but the truth of it pressed against him. He set the skillet on the fire, the smell of browning flour rising, filling the cabin. He broke the silence. "I'll ride into town later. Bring back shoes. Something better than that dress, too." Her eyes flicked down to the torn neckline that frayed him. For the first time since he'd seen her, her hand came up to cover her chest, almost protective. She didn't thank him, but she didn't argue either. By mid-morning, Clay saddled the horse. He hesitated at the door, looking back at her. "You'll be safe here. Don't open to anyone." Naya tilted her head, uncertain. "Who come?" Clay's jaw tightened. "Sometimes traders cut through, or neighbors ride by. Not often, but if they see you, there be talk." He didn't add what kind of talk. He didn't need to. She understood enough. The ride to town was long, and Clay felt the weight of every mile. He kept his hat low, kept his mouth shut when he stepped into the dry goods store. He bought a plain cotton dress, nothing fancy, just sturdy, and a pair of shoes that looked close enough to her size. When the storekeeper raised a brow, Clay ignored it. He left quick, keeping his purchases wrapped tight under his arm. Back at the cabin, he found her sitting just where he left her, feeding sticks into the fire. She looked at the bundle he carried, suspicion clouding her face, as if unsure what it meant. He set it down near her without explanation. "For you." Her hands lingered over the fabric, testing the weight. She unfolded the dress slowly, eyes narrowing as though expecting some hidden demand. When none came, she folded it again and set it aside, her face unreadable. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned. Clay worked outside, splitting wood, mending the sagging corral fence, patching the barn roof. Naya remained close to the cabin, but each day she took on more small tasks. She swept dirt from the floor, fetched water from the creek in his dented pail, stirred beans at the stove when his hands were busy. She did it quietly, without being asked, but also without warmth. It wasn't kindness, it was survival. At night, they stayed on opposite sides of the cabin. Clay on his cot, boots on, rifle within reach. Naya on the blanket near the fire. They didn't speak much, only enough to pass the day. But something began to shift. The silence between them was no longer jagged, no longer a thing that threatened to snap. It was stillness that carried weight, and in that stillness, they learned the shape of each other's presence. Clay noticed the way she held herself, always upright, proud, even with exhaustion weighing her down. He noticed the faint limp when she walked, likely from a knee she had bruised on the trading post plank. He wondered if she had been beaten before, but he never asked. He noticed too how her eyes softened slightly when she worked near the horse, the only time she seemed less guarded. Naya, in turn, studied him. She watched the way he moved, slow, deliberate, never rushing her, never crowding her. She saw how he set his tools aside at the same place each day, how he muttered under his breath when a fence post wouldn't hold. She noticed he never raised his voice, never touched her without cause. It didn't erase her mistrust, but it was different than what she expected. On the fourth day, a rider passed along the ridge beyond the creek. Clay was outside, repairing the gate when he spotted him. A neighbor, a man named Jeb Rollins, who had a mouth as loose as his morals. Clay's chest tightened. If Jeb caught sight of Naya, word would spread through town before sunset. He walked back inside, his boots heavy on the floor. Naya looked up from where she sat, mending the hem of the new dress with strips of cord. "Someone?" she asked. "Neighbor," Clay answered, voice low. "Keep away from the window." Her brows pulled tight, but she obeyed, drawing back into the corner where the shadows fell deeper. Clay stood near the door until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he exhale. He knew it was only a matter of time before others learned she was here. And when they did, the questions would come hard. That night, as they sat by the fire, Naya finally asked the question that had been in her eyes since the start. "Why you do this? Why spend your coins?" Clay stared at the flames a long while before answering. His voice was steady but low. Couldn't stomach watching. That's all. She studied him, eyes searching for the piece that didn't fit. In her world, men didn't do things without reason. They didn't give without expecting. But Clay didn't say anything more. He simply leaned back, folded his arms, and closed his eyes against the firelight. The silence lingered, but it was no longer the same. By the fifth morning together, the rhythm of life in the cabin had changed in ways Clay hadn't expected. The chores were the same: splitting wood, hauling water, patching fences, boiling beans, but the silence carried differently. Where once the cabin had echoed with nothing but his own footsteps, now there were two sets moving across the worn floorboards. Naya's presence filled the space in small, steady ways. Her careful sweeping, the sound of her soft steps to the creek, the quiet clatter of her spoon in the pot. It unsettled him at first, then settled into something he couldn't quite name. Naya's health was improving slowly. The hollow look in her face softened after regular meals. The raw skin at her wrists had begun to scab over, though she still rubbed them absent-mindedly, as if the memory of ropes still pressed there. Her feet, cut and bruised from walking barefoot too long, remained tender. Clay noticed her wince sometimes when she moved across the packed dirt floor, though she tried to hide it. He left the shoes he had bought near her blanket, saying nothing. After a few days, she began to wear them, breaking them in with short walks outside the cabin. Clay never asked her to explain where she came from or how she had been taken. The answers might come one day, or they might not. What mattered was that she was here now. He knew the land well enough to realize she had nowhere else safe to turn. But word was already spreading. On his trip to town for supplies, Clay felt the weight of eyes on him heavier than usual. The storekeeper kept his questions short, but there was something in his stare, curiosity sharpened into judgment. A pair of ranch hands near the saloon muttered as Clay passed, their voices low but their laughter sharp. He ignored it, but it burned in his gut. Jeb Rollins must have spoken after spotting the figure near Clay's cabin days earlier. That meant talk was traveling fast, and soon it would become more than whispers. When he returned, Naya was standing near the corral, her hand brushing the flank of his gelding. She looked up as he approached, wary but calmer than before. The sight of her outside unsettled him. If neighbors had seen once, they could see again, but he said nothing, only handed her the small bundle he carried: salt, coffee, and a bit of dried pork. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke first. They talked. Her voice was quiet but direct. Clay glanced at her, surprised she had asked. He gave a short nod. Some. Her jaw tightened. Bad talk. He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, weighing his words. Most folks don't understand. They don't care to. But it's my land, my cabin. They don't get a say in who I share it with. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then looked back at the fire. She didn't press the subject again, but the question had already carved itself between them. How long before outside judgment turned into trouble? Days slid into a quiet routine. Clay noticed changes in small things. When she stirred the beans at the stove, she set aside a portion for him without asking. When he came back from working the fence line, she had already stacked fresh wood by the hearth. They didn't speak much, but each gesture carried weight. At night, the silence pressed closest. He on the cot, she on the blanket. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, he found himself watching the outline of her shape beneath the blanket, the rise and fall of her breathing. He told himself to look away, and most times he did, but the image lingered. One evening, as he sat repairing his saddle strap, she moved past him to reach the shelf. Her hip brushed his shoulder, barely a touch, but enough to make him freeze for a moment. She didn't react, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to. His hands stilled on the leather, his jaw tight, before he forced himself to continue. Naya, for her part, had begun watching him differently. She noticed the lines on his face when he worked outside, the way his shirt clung to his back with sweat, the quiet patience in his hands as he repaired tools worn near to breaking. She didn't let him see her looking, but at night, when he turned away on the cot, her eyes lingered in the firelight before she lay down herself. One cold night, as wind rattled the shutters, the fire burned lower than usual. Naya pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but still shivered. Clay noticed. He sat up, hesitating before speaking. "You want another blanket?" She looked at him, her eyes sharp, then softer. "You give everything. Coins, food, clothes. Why?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He looked down at his calloused hands, the leather strap forgotten in his grip. His voice came slow. "Because I couldn't leave you there. That's reason enough." Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to measure the truth of his words. Finally, she gave a small nod, pulling the blanket tighter. She didn't thank him, not in words, but the tension in her shoulders eased, just a little. For Clay, the cabin no longer felt like just a place to sleep between long days of labor. It felt different, heavier, as if every sound, every glance, carried meaning. He knew trust was a long way off, but he also knew she hadn't run. She had chosen to stay another day, and then another. That choice mattered, and as the firelight flickered against her face, casting shadows across her strong features and the curve of her shoulders beneath the blanket, Clay realized something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The silence between them was no longer just survival. It was the start of something neither of them had words for yet. The days that followed carried a new tension, one that neither Clay nor Naya spoke of directly. The chores remained the same, but something lingered in the air. Longer looks, pauses that stretched too far, the way their hands sometimes brushed when passing a cup or tool. Clay kept his distance out of habit and caution, but he could feel the shift all the same. One morning, as he saddled his horse to ride into town for more grain, Naya stood in the doorway watching him. She wore the cotton dress he had bought, cinched at the waist with a strip of leather cord. It fit her better than the torn deerskin, but her bare shoulders still carried the faint marks of rope burn. He caught himself looking longer than he should, then pulled his eyes away. "You need anything?" he asked, his tone even. Her brows furrowed, as if testing whether he meant the question. "No." He gave a short nod and mounted up. She stayed in the doorway until he disappeared over the ridge. Town was colder this time. The whispers had thickened into something sharper. A man outside the saloon muttered loud enough for Clay to hear. "Mercer's got himself a squaw in that cabin. Heard he paid for her same as you'd buy a mule." Laughter followed, ugly and cutting. Clay's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to it. He finished his errands, kept his head down, and left fast. But the words stuck to him like burrs all the way home. When he returned, Naya was tending a small pot over the fire. The smell of stew filled the cabin. She had added strips of dried pork he'd brought last week. She glanced at him when he entered, her eyes flicking over his face. She seemed to sense the weight on him. "They speak of me," she said quietly, more statement than question. Clay set the grain sack down, meeting her gaze. "They don't know you. They don't matter." Her lips pressed tight, and she stirred the pot harder than needed. "Words matter. They follow." He didn't deny it. He just leaned back against the wall, arms folded. "Let them talk. My land. My home. Not theirs." The firmness in his tone seemed to steady her a little, though he saw the doubt still flicker in her eyes. That night, The wind howled against the shutters, colder than before. Clay threw another log on the fire. He sat at the table, oiling the rifle, while Naya sat near the hearth, mending her dress again with the thin cord she had twisted days earlier. Silence stretched, but it was softer than before. When she finished, she laid the dress aside and spoke suddenly, her voice low. "The man who sold me. He came to our camp with soldiers. Took many. Some killed. Some worse." Her words faltered, but she forced them through. "They sell us like cattle. Use us. You paid too. But you are not like them." Clay froze, the cloth stilling on the barrel of his rifle. Her words cut into him, sharp but true. He set the gun down slowly. "I didn't buy you to own you. I paid to stop them." Her eyes searched his face for any sign of deceit. Finding none, she gave a small nod, though mistrust still lingered like a shadow. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and turned back toward the fire. Later that night, as the flames burned low, she shivered beneath the blanket. Clay noticed from a cot. He hesitated, fighting himself, then stood. He lifted another wool blanket from the trunk and walked over, holding it out. She looked up at him, her eyes wary but softer than before. "You'll be warmer with this," he said. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch lingered longer than either expected. Clay's breath caught, his chest tightening. He pulled back quickly, retreating to the cot, lowering himself stiffly. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind a storm. The next morning, something had shifted again. She moved more freely in the cabin, less like a cornered animal. She even asked him once, haltingly, how to grind corn into meal. He showed her, their hands brushing as he guided the stone. She pulled back quickly, but not with the sharpness of before. That evening, as they ate, she studied him across the table. "You live alone long time?" He nodded. "Since the war. Since my wife and boy died." He said it plain, without decoration. Her eyes softened for a moment. "Why me, then?" He held her gaze, voice steady. "Because no one should be left like that. Not while I can help it." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It carried something else, an understanding neither of them could put into words. Later, when the fire had burned low, Clay lay on the cot while Naya rested on the floor. In the quiet, he heard her shift. Then her voice came soft through the dark. "You are not like the others." He didn't answer. His throat felt too tight. But inside, something broke open, something he had buried for years. And for the first time since she arrived, he realized he no longer feared that she might leave. He feared instead what it might mean if she chose to stay. The morning broke clear after a night of restless silence. Clay had hardly slept. He lay awake long after Naya's words drifted into the dark. "You are not like the others." They had settled deep inside him, stirring something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. By dawn, his chest was tight with the weight of it. He rose quietly, pulling on his boots, moving through the motions of work, though his mind wasn't steady. Naya was already awake, crouched by the fire, feeding in small sticks. She glanced up as he passed, her dark eyes catching his, then darting away quickly. She wrapped the blanket closer around her shoulders, though the air inside wasn't so cold anymore. Clay noticed the faint color in her cheeks, a sign she was no longer starving, no longer so hollow. The sight eased something in him, but it also drew his gaze longer than it should have. He forced himself outside. The day stretched into labor. Clay worked the corral fence, replacing broken rails with new cedar he had hauled weeks before. His muscles ached, sweat clung to his shirt, and each swing of the hammer steadied him. Work was the one thing he could trust to keep his mind from running wild. Yet even then, his thoughts kept circling back to her, how she had begun to move differently in the cabin, less like a guest and more like someone finding her place. When he returned at midday, the cabin smelled of beans and pork stew. Naya had cooked again, and this time she set 2 plates without waiting for him to ask. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them, but the air was charged. Clay felt her eyes on him once or twice, quick and uncertain, and when he looked up she turned away fast. After the meal, Naya surprised him by speaking. "Before, I was taken. I had a husband. He died when soldiers come. My people scattered. Her voice was flat, but the words carried weight. I thought I would die too. Clay listened, his fork still in his hand. He didn't push her for more, but the fact she had offered this much at all told him something had shifted. I'm sorry, he said simply. She looked at him across the table, her eyes sharp but not hostile. You lost too. He gave a short nod. Wife and boy. Fever took them. The words hung heavy in the small room, two losses sitting side by side. Neither spoke for a long while. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Clay sat by the fire, mending a rope, while Naya stretched out on the blanket. She shifted once, then again, finally pulling herself up to sit. Too cold, she said softly, almost embarrassed. Clay looked at her, then at the cot. He hesitated before speaking. Cot's warmer. I'll take the floor. She studied him a long moment, then shook her head. No, you stay. She pulled the blanket tighter. I stay here. But when he lay down on the cot, he could hear her shivering still. He lay awake, the sound clawing at him. Finally, he pushed up, grabbed his own blanket, and laid it gently across her without a word. Her eyes opened at the touch, dark and unreadable. For a moment, their hands brushed, hers lingering just long enough for him to feel the warmth. He pulled back quickly, retreating to his cot again. The next day, while Clay worked outside, a rider appeared on the ridge, Jeb Rollins again. This time he slowed, reining in his horse to watch Clay hammering at the fence. His eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at his lips. Heard you got company out here, Mercer, he called out, voice carrying across the open ground. Word is she's Apache. That true. Clay straightened slowly, hammer still in his hand. Ain't your business, Jeb. Jeb chuckled, spitting in the dirt. Town's talking plenty. Don't look good. Man living alone, bringing home a squaw he bought off a trader? Folks say what they will. Clay's jaw locked. He stepped closer to the fence, his voice low but edged with steel. You mind your land. I'll mind mine. Jeb lingered a moment, eyes sharp with curiosity, then turned his horse and rode off. Clay watched him go, the unease gnawing at him. He knew the man's words wouldn't stop at the ridge. They'd spread like fire on dry grass. Back in the cabin, Naya noticed his tight shoulders. Trouble? She asked. Just talk, he answered, hanging his hat on the peg. But talk can turn ugly. You stay close to the cabin. Don't show yourself unless you have to. She nodded once, though her jaw was firm. I'm not afraid. Clay looked at her, admiration stirring despite himself. She had endured more than most, yet still carried herself with pride. That evening, the firelight threw long shadows across the cabin walls. Clay sat near the hearth, his rifle propped within reach, while Naya tended the pot. When she leaned over to stir, her neckline slipped, the fabric loose from too much wear. Clay's eyes caught for a second, his chest tightening, but he forced himself to look away. Respect was all that kept him steady, and he clung to it like a lifeline. But she noticed. She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching his in the flicker of firelight. She didn't pull the fabric up. She didn't move to hide. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment, her face unreadable, testing. Clay's throat went dry. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Finally, he said, his voice rough, "You're safe here. Don't ever doubt that." Her eyes softened, just slightly but enough. She looked back at the fire, the corner of her mouth tightening as if holding back words. That night, when she lay down on the blanket, Clay couldn't sleep. He turned on the cot, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of her presence more than ever. After a long while, she spoke into the dark. I think maybe you're different. Not all men are the same. He swallowed hard, staring at the ceiling beams. I ain't perfect, but I'll never hurt you. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with something new, something fragile and growing. For the first time since she had stepped into his life, Clay allowed himself to believe she might truly choose to stay. The following days carried a weight that was different than before. Clay noticed it in the way Naya moved through the cabin. Her steps slower, her glances longer, the pauses between her words stretching as though she were measuring what to say and what to hold back. He noticed it most in the silence between them at night, when the fire burned low and every breath seemed too loud in the one-room cabin. On the morning after Jeb Rollins had ridden by, Clay stood out near the corral, checking the posts again, but his mind wasn't on the fence. He was thinking of the man's words, how they would twist through town like weeds. He didn't care much what people thought of him. He had lived with whispers for years, but the thought of Naya being spoken of as property, as shame, made his jaw grind tight. He had no words to fix it, only the promise in his chest that he would keep her safe. Inside, Naya had begun to claim small parts of the cabin as her own. She folded her blanket neatly each morning. She set the cooking pot in the same place on the hearth every night. She even repaired one of his shirts, the one torn at the elbow, leaving the stitching a little uneven but holding strong. Clay had picked it up without comment, but he had worn it the next day, and she had noticed. Neither spoke of it, yet said enough. Naya had cooked again, and this time she set 2 plates without waiting for him to ask. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them, but the air was charged. Clay felt her eyes on him once or twice, quick and uncertain, and when he looked up she turned away fast. After the meal, Naya surprised him by speaking. Before, I was taken. I had a husband. He died when soldiers come. My people scattered. Her voice was flat, but the words carried weight. I thought I would die too. Clay listened, his fork still in his hand. He didn't push her for more, but the fact she had offered this much at all told him something had shifted. I'm sorry, he said simply. You come back. Maybe, Clay admitted, but I'll handle it. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You protect me. Why? He set the knife down, looking at her straight. Because you deserve it. Simple as that. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on his, dark and searching, as though weighing the truth of his words against every betrayal she had known. Then she looked back at the fire, her lips pressing tight, but her shoulders eased. The night wore on, the storm beating hard against the cabin walls. Naya lay on her blanket near the fire, but sleep didn't come easy. She shifted, restless. Clay watched from the cot, his chest tightening as he saw her curl in on herself against the chill. Finally, he stood, pulling his blanket with him. He knelt beside her, holding it out. You'll freeze if you don't take this. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with something between suspicion and something softer. And you? I'll be fine. His voice was firm, steady. Slowly, she reached for the blanket. Their fingers brushed again, longer this time, neither of them pulling back quickly. She spread the blanket over herself, then, after a pause, shifted it slightly, leaving room. Her eyes lifted to his, a question unspoken. Clay's throat went dry. His body ached to lie down beside her, but his mind fought against it. He stayed still until she whispered, I'm not afraid. The words hit him harder than he expected. His eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at his lips. Heard you got company out here, Mercer, he called out, voice carrying across the open ground. Word is she's Apache. That true? Clay straightened slowly, hammer still in his hand. Ain't your business, Jeb. Jeb chuckled, spitting in the dirt. Town's talking plenty. Don't look good. Man living alone. Bringing home a squaw he bought off a trader? Folks say what they will. Clay's jaw locked. He stepped closer to the fence, his voice low but edged with steel. You mind your land. I'll mind mine. Jeb lingered a moment, eyes sharp with curiosity, then turned his horse and rode off. Clay watched him go, the unease gnawing at him. He knew the man's words wouldn't stop at the ridge. The kiss was soft, hesitant, but real. An unspoken choice passed between them. His hand rose, resting against her waist, but he kept it there, steady, letting her decide how far. When she didn't pull away, when instead she pressed closer, deepening the kiss, something inside him broke loose. For years he had lived in silence, in loss, in the belief that nothing could fill the emptiness left behind. Yet here, in this storm-lit cabin, with this woman who had every reason to distrust him, he felt life return. When they pulled apart, Naya's forehead rested against his. Her voice came low. You keep saying safe. Now I believe. Clay swallowed hard, his hand still warm on her waist. And I'll keep proving it. Clay's eyes caught for a second, his chest tightening, but he forced himself to look away. Respect was all that kept him steady, and he clung to it like a lifeline. But she noticed. She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching his in the flicker of firelight. She didn't pull the fabric up. She didn't move to hide. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment, her face unreadable, testing. Clay's throat went dry. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Finally, he said, his voice rough, "You're safe here. Don't ever doubt that." Her eyes softened, just slightly but enough. She looked back at the fire, the corner of her mouth tightening as if holding back words. That night, when she lay down on the blanket, Clay couldn't sleep. Clay knew the world outside would never see her that way. To them, she would always be the Apache woman he brought home. But he also knew this. She had chosen to stay another night, and now another morning. That choice was worth more than any man's judgment. The morning after the storm broke with a stillness that felt different. Clay stepped out into the yard, his boots sinking slightly in the wet earth. The sky stretched wide and clear, the air sharp with the smell of rain-soaked mesquite. Inside the cabin, Naya moved quietly, folding blankets, tidying the table, stoking the fire. Her presence was no longer uncertain, no longer edged with suspicion. She moved with the calm of someone who had decided, though she hadn't spoken the words yet. Clay worked the corral fence while the sun climbed. His hands were steady on the hammer, but his mind kept circling back to the night before. The warmth of her hand against his arm, the feel of her lips, the quiet certainty in her voice when she said she believed him. It had been years since he'd let anyone close enough to stir that kind of feeling, and now it consumed him. He didn't regret a second of it. By midday, as he carried water from the creek, a shadow appeared on the ridge. Jeb Rollins again, this time with two other men trailing behind him. They reined in their horses just out of reach, eyes fixed on the cabin. Clay felt the knot tighten in his gut. He set the pail down slowly, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver though he didn't draw. Jeb called out, voice loud, carrying across the wet ground. "Mercer, folks in town say you've got a squaw holed up in there. They say you bought her. We don't take kindly to that sort of thing." Clay's jaw set. He stepped forward, planting his boots in the mud. "Ain't your business what I do on my land." One of the men snorted. "You think you could just bring one of them here? Act like it's normal? People are talking. Ain't right." Clay's eyes narrowed, his voice low but clear. "She's free. She stays because she chooses to. Any man who tries to say otherwise can answer to me." There was a tense silence, the three men shifting in their saddles. Clay's hand hovered near his revolver, but his voice never wavered. After a long moment, Jeb spat in the dirt and tugged his reins. "You'll regret it, Mercer," he muttered before turning his horse. The others followed. Clay stood there until their shapes disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he breathe, his chest heavy. He turned back toward the cabin, where Naya stood just inside the doorway. She had heard every word. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. That evening, after chores were finished, they sat by the fire. The silence between them felt charged, but no longer fragile. Naya stirred the pot absent-mindedly, her eyes distant. Finally, she spoke. "If I stay, they hate you more." Clay leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let them. I've lived with people's hate before. Don't change what I do." She studied him, her lips pressing tight. "You want me to stay?" His throat tightened, but he didn't hesitate. "Yes. Not because I bought you. Not because I pity you. Because I want you here. With me." For a long moment she was silent, the firelight flickering across her face. Then she nodded, slow but firm. "Then I stay." The words landed heavy and certain. Clay felt his chest loosen in a way it hadn't in years. He reached into the small trunk at the foot of his cot, pulling out something he had worked on that afternoon. A thin band of iron, hammered smooth, shaped with the same hands that had built every board in the cabin. He held it out, awkward but steady. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's what I can give. A promise." Her eyes widened slightly. She took the band in her fingers, turning it over in the firelight. Then she looked back at him, her voice steady. "I wear it, because I choose." He slid the ring onto her finger, his calloused hand trembling slightly. She let him, her eyes never leaving his. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, her lips brushing his. The kiss was deeper this time, Sure, filled with something more than need. It carried belonging, choice, and the promise of a life no one else would define for them. That night, they lay together not as strangers bound by chance, but as two people who had chosen to stay. Clay wrapped his arm around her waist, feeling her body rest against his with no tension, no hesitation. She whispered into the dark, "No one take me now." His voice came rough but steady. "Not while I breathe." In the days that followed, gossip in town grew, but Clay didn't care. He rode in only when necessary, and when men muttered, he ignored them. He had survived war, loss, and years of loneliness. No man's tongue could break him now. Back at the cabin, the land slowly turned green with spring, and Naya planted seeds by the porch, her hands pressing life into the soil. She laughed once at the horse's stubbornness, and the sound filled Clay's chest with something he thought he'd never hear again. The cabin was no longer just a shelter for one man. It was a home. The fire burned each night, two places by it now instead of one. And when Clay lay beside her, her hand resting over the iron band he had given, he knew without question his life had changed the day he spent his last pennies. He hadn't bought her. He had freed her. And in return, she had given him back something he thought was gone forever, a family built not by blood or law but by choice.